There was a city where, for 1100 years, men and women went to sleep each night as citizens of the Roman Empire, and not one of them ever called themselves Byzantine. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans. They spoke Greek in the marketplace and prayed in Greek in their churches, and for centuries they wrote their laws in a Latin that had already begun to fade from their tongues. When a traveller from the far west asked them who they were, they did not hesitate. "We are the Romans," they said. "Our emperor sits in the city of Constantine." The empire did not fall, it only moved. For most of 1,000 years, that answer was simply true, while the western provinces slipped away one by one. While Gaul became France, and Britain fell into legend, and the Senate house in Rome stood empty with grass in its cracks, there was still a Roman emperor. He was crowned in a church of gold and porphyry. He signed documents in purple ink that no other hand in the world was permitted to use. He ruled from a city set on a narrow strip of land between two seas, a city with walls so vast that armies would sit down in front of them and grow old and go home. They called it Constantinople. It had been a small Greek fishing town once, and before that only a headland where currents met, and the fish ran thick in the spring. Then one man looked at the water and saw a capital. The empire that grew from that decision would outlive every rival that came against it. It would be attacked by Persians, by Avars, by Arabs, by Bulgars, by Rus, by Normans, by Turks, and by fellow Christians who came wearing crosses on their shoulders. It would be given up for dead a dozen times and rise again, each time thinner, stranger, still Roman. It preserved the plays of Athens and the geometry of Euclid, while Western monks were forgetting how to read them. It invented a weapon that burned on water and told no one the recipe, so that we do not know it to this day. And then, on a Tuesday morning, in the spring of 1453, after a siege of 53 days, the last Roman emperor tore off his imperial ornaments so that no one would know him among the dead, and walked down into a breach in the wall and was never seen again. This is the story of the Byzantine Empire, of how Rome moved east and lived a second life, of the emperors and empresses who held it together, the plagues and the fires and the sieges, the arguments about icons that emptied cities of their paint, the silks and the spices and the strange rituals of a court that made ambassadors faint. It is a long story, and it does not hurry. So, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let your breathing slow. And, if you feel like it before you drift off, leave a comment saying where in the world you are listening from, and what hour it is where you lie. We begin a long way back, in a Roman world that had grown too heavy to carry. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was suffering from a problem that no one at the time could name properly. It was simply too large for one man to hold. The trouble was not only distance, although distance was part of it. A message travelling from the Rhine frontier to the Euphrates might take 2 months in good weather, and rather longer when the passes filled with snow. It was that the empire now had 2 long borders under pressure at the same time, and only one emperor. On the northern rivers, Germanic peoples were pressing south, in numbers that no earlier generation had seen. On the eastern edge, a new Persian dynasty called the Sasanians had replaced the sleepy Parthian kings and had ambitions of their own, and they were far better organised than anything Rome had faced in that direction for 3 centuries. An emperor could ride north, or he could ride east. He could not do both, and whichever way he rode, the army he left behind would begin, sooner or later, to wonder why it should not have an emperor of its own. The result was a period that historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, and it very nearly ended everything. In 50 years, the empire had more than 20 emperors, and a great many more men who claimed the title and did not survive long enough to be counted. Most died violently. Some ruled for a few weeks. One was captured alive by the Persian king and, according to the story the Persians told afterwards, was made to kneel in the dust so that the king could use his back as a step when mounting his horse. Whether or not that happened, the fact that Romans believed it says something about how the age felt from the inside. The coinage collapsed. Silver coins were struck thinner and thinner until they were copper with a wash of silver on them that rubbed away in the palm of your hand, and prices ran wild. Trade shrank. Cities that had never needed defences began to build walls, often out of the tombs and temples that stood outside them, so that if you walked those walls afterwards, you would see the faces of the dead built sideways into the stone. Country roads emptied. Plague came through more than once, as it always did when armies moved. And then somehow it held. The men who saved it were not aristocrats from old Italian families. They were hard soldiers from the Balkan provinces, from what is now Serbia and Croatia and Bulgaria. Men who had come up through the ranks and had no patience for the polite fictions of the old republic. The greatest of them was a commander named Diocletian, who took the throne in 284 and did something that none of his predecessors had dared. He looked at the problem honestly and admitted that one man could not do the work. So he divided it. He appointed a colleague of equal rank to govern the West while he governed the East, and then each of them appointed a junior colleague and heir. 4 rulers. The arrangement is usually called the tetrarchy, which simply means rule of 4. It was not a division of the empire, at least not in theory. There was still one Roman state, one body of law, one army. There were now simply 4 pairs of hands on it. Diocletian did more than that. He rebuilt the tax system on a new footing, counting land and people together in units so that the government could predict its revenue instead of guessing at it. He froze prices by edict across the whole empire, which did not work, but which tells us how bad inflation had become. He enlarged the army and split the provinces into smaller pieces, so that no single governor commanded enough soldiers to make himself emperor, and he changed the way an emperor looked and behaved. The old emperors had at least pretended to be first among citizens. They wore a toga. They greeted senators by name. Diocletian ended all that. He robed himself in silk stiff with gold thread, wore a jewelled diadem, and required those who approached him to prostrate themselves and kiss the hem of his garment. He surrounded himself with ceremony as thick as armour. His court was hushed and slow, and full of eunuch chamberlains who controlled who could enter. Some of this was theatre, but it was theatre with a purpose. An emperor who was merely a successful general could be replaced by another successful general. An emperor who was a sacred figure, half hidden behind curtains, was harder to imagine away. Every one of these changes would still be visible in Constantinople, 1,000 years later. The Byzantine court, that astonished visitors in the 10th century, with its mechanical golden birds and its rising throne, was Diocletian's court, grown older and more elaborate. The Byzantine tax rolls, the Byzantine provincial divisions, the Byzantine idea of an emperor as the living icon of God's order on earth. All of it began in these years of desperate repair. Diocletian also did one thing that history remembers more darkly. In the last years of his reign, he ordered the most severe persecution of Christians that the empire ever attempted. Churches were pulled down, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned, and in some provinces, ordinary believers were killed in numbers. It failed. Within a single generation, the same throne would be occupied by a man who built churches with public money. And then, In 305, Diocletian did the strangest thing of all. He retired. No Roman emperor had ever simply walked away from the office, alive and by choice. He went home to the coast of Dalmatia, to an enormous fortified palace he had built for himself by the sea at Split, and he grew vegetables when old colleagues came begging him to return and settle the quarrels that had broken out among his successors. He is supposed to have told them that if they could see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would not ask him such a thing. The quarrels he refused to settle would run for nearly 20 years. Out of them came the man who moved the centre of the Roman world. His name was Constantine, and he was the son of one of the 4 tetrarchs, which under Diocletian's system should have counted for nothing. Merit was supposed to decide the succession, not blood. But when his father died at York in the far north of Britain in 306, the soldiers of the northern army did what Roman soldiers had always done. They put the purple cloak on the young man standing nearest the body and cheered. It took him 18 years to make that acclamation mean what he wanted it to mean. He fought his way south through Gaul, then across the Alps into Italy, then east across the Balkans, defeating in turn every other man who claimed a share of the empire. He was patient, and he was lucky, and he was a genuinely gifted commander, who understood that speed frightens men more than numbers do. But the moment everyone remembers came in the autumn of 312, on the road north of Rome, at a bridge across the Tiber called the Milvian Bridge. His rival there was Maxentius, who held the city itself and had the larger army. On the night before the battle, according to the account Constantine gave years afterwards to a bishop who wrote it down, he saw a sign of light above the sun and a message telling him to conquer by it. In a dream that followed, he was told to mark his soldiers' shields with a symbol made of the first 2 Greek letters of the name of Christ. He did. The next day, Maxentius, for reasons no one has ever satisfactorily explained, came out from behind the strong walls of Rome and fought with the river at his back. His army broke. The bridge of boats his engineers had built collapsed under the retreat, and Maxentius drowned in the Tiber in his armour. They fished his body out and carried the head through the streets. Constantine entered Rome as its master, and did not sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, as every victorious Roman general had done for 800 years. He simply went to the palace instead. It was a small thing, and everyone noticed it. The following year, together with his eastern colleague Licinius, he issued the settlement, here usually called the Edict of Milan, which ended the persecution and granted Christians and everyone else the right to worship as they chose. It is worth pausing on what that meant. At the time, Christians were perhaps 1/10 of the empire, more in the eastern cities, far fewer in the countryside and the western provinces. They were a minority who had just spent a decade being hunted. Within a single lifetime, they would be the establishment, and by the end of the century, it would be the old gods who were illegal. Constantine's own beliefs remained difficult to read. He kept the title of chief priest of the old Roman religion. Coins from the middle of his reign still show the unconquered sun. He was not baptized until he lay dying, which was common at the time among people who wanted to enter the next world with the slate wiped clean. But he built the first great church over the tomb of St. Peter on the Vatican Hill. He built at Jerusalem, where his mother Helena went in her old age, and came back with relics and stories that would echo through the Middle Ages. And most importantly, he presided in person over the first great council of the whole Christian Church. It met in 325 at Nicaea, a town in what is now northwestern Turkey, and the question before it was as simple to state as it was impossible to settle. Was Christ of the same substance as God the Father, eternal and uncreated, or was he the first and highest of created things? A priest of Alexandria named Arius had argued for the second view, and half the East had followed him. The council came down for the first, and the statement of belief it produced, the Nicene Creed, is still recited in churches every Sunday across the world. What matters for our story is not the theology, but the precedent. A Roman emperor had summoned the bishops, paid for their travel, sat among them, and pressed them to agree. From that moment on, in the eastern half of the empire, the emperor and the church were bound together in a way that would never quite come apart. Doctrine was a matter of state. Riots over the nature of Christ would burn city quarters. Emperors would be deposed over a word. Constantine also removed his last rival, Licinius, in 324, and, for the first time in 40 years, one man ruled the whole Roman world. And then, almost immediately, he decided to build a new capital for it. Rome had been failing as a capital for a long time. It sat too far from both threatened frontiers. Emperors had already spent most of the previous century living elsewhere, at Trier on the Moselle, at Milan, at Sirmium on the Danube, at Nicomedia in Asia Minor, wherever the fighting was. Rome was a museum, magnificent and expensive, and full of senators with opinions. Constantine considered several sites. There is a story that he began work at Troy, on the plain where the Iliad is set, and abandoned it. In the end, he chose a small ancient Greek city called Byzantine, which had been founded, so the legend went, by a colonist named Byzas nearly 1,000 years earlier. Look at where it sits. The choice explains itself. It stands on a triangular promontory at the very edge of Europe, with Asia visible across the water. On one side is the Sea of Marmara. On the other is a deep, narrow, sheltered inlet called the Golden Horn, one of the finest natural harbours in the world, so deep that ships can moor against the shore. To the northeast, the Bosphorus runs up to the Black Sea. To the southwest, the Dardanelles run down to the Aegean and the Mediterranean. Every ship that carried grain from the Crimea, or timber from the Caucasus, or slaves and furs from the rivers of the north, had to pass this point. Every army marching between Europe and Asia had to cross here or go a very long way around. And on the landward side, there is only a narrow neck, perhaps 6 kilometres across in Constantine's time, which meant that with water on two sides, a city here needed only one wall. Work began in 324, and the dedication came 6 years later, in the spring of 330. Constantine gave it the modest official name New Rome, and everyone ignored that immediately and called it the city of Constantine. Constantinople. He built it fast, which is to say, he built it partly by robbery. Statues, columns, and works of art were stripped from temples and public squares all over the Greek world and shipped in to fill the new forums. A bronze column of 3 intertwined serpents that had stood at Delphi since the Greeks defeated the Persians 8 centuries before, was uprooted and set up in the Hippodrome, where a piece of it still stands today. He laid out a great oval racecourse for chariots, a senate house, a palace, colonnaded avenues running from a central milestone that measured the distances of the world. To fill the city, he offered free bread to anyone who would move there, diverting part of the Egyptian grain fleet that had fed Rome for centuries. He gave land to senators willing to relocate and built them houses. Within a generation, the population was in the hundreds of thousands. Within 2, it was the largest city in Europe and would remain so for 800 years. It was also, from the beginning, a Christian city in a way that Rome could never be. Rome was thick with old temples and older families who liked them. Constantinople had almost no pagan past to inherit. Its great buildings were churches, its holiest possessions were relics rather than idols, and it was placed under the protection not of Jupiter, but of the Virgin, who would be invoked from its walls in every siege for 1100 years. Constantine died in 337, on the road east, planning a Persian campaign he never fought. He was baptized on his deathbed by a bishop who happened to be an Arian, which embarrassed later writers considerably. His body was carried back to the city he had made and laid in a church he had built for the purpose, surrounded by memorials to the 12 apostles, in the place where a 13th might have stood. He left the empire to his 3 surviving sons, who immediately arranged the murder of most of their male relatives, and then fought one another. That pattern too would repeat. But the city was there now, and the centre of gravity of the Roman world had shifted east, onto that windy headland between 2 seas, and it was never going to shift back. The century that followed was the century in which the 2 halves of the Roman world quietly stopped being one thing. Nobody decided it. There was no treaty of separation, no moment when a herald announced that the empire was now 2 empires. The law remained single. A statute issued at Constantinople was valid at Ravenna, and coins struck in one half circulated in the other. Men still spoke of the Roman world as a single body with 2 hands, but the hands began to move differently, and after a while they stopped reaching for the same things. The turning point came in the year 378, on a hot August afternoon, near the city of Adrianople in Thrace, less than a week's march from Constantinople itself. 2 years earlier, a great mass of Gothic people had come to the Danube asking to be let in. They were not raiders. They were refugees, families with wagons and cattle fleeing something worse behind them. On the steppe, a people called the Huns, whose name was only just beginning to be known and already carried a particular kind of dread. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, agreed to admit them, partly out of policy, since they would make useful soldiers, and partly because he could not easily have stopped them. The admission was handled disgracefully. Roman officials on the river charged the starving Goths ruinous prices for dog meat and took their children as slaves in payment. Predictably, the Goths rose. For 2 years they burned their way across Thrace. Then, Valens brought his field army out to finish it, refused to wait for the Western army that was marching to join him, and attacked in the afternoon heat, while his men were tired and thirsty. The Gothic cavalry, which had been away foraging, came back at exactly the wrong moment for Rome. The Roman infantry was pressed together so tightly that men could not raise their arms to use their swords. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army died on that field, along with the emperor, whose body was never identified. A historian of the time, a soldier himself, called it the worst defeat since Hannibal. The empire survived, because empires can survive one lost battle, but it survived by making a bargain that changed its nature. The new emperor, Theodosius, could not destroy the Goths, so he settled them inside the frontier, as allies, on their own land, under their own chiefs, paid to fight for Rome but not absorbed into it. It was practical. It was also the first crack in the idea that had held the Roman world together, the idea that everyone inside the border eventually became Roman. Theodosius was the last man to rule both halves of the empire, and he only managed it for a few months. He was a devout Nicene Christian from Spain, and it was under him that the old religion was finally outlawed outright, its temples closed, its sacrifices forbidden. The Olympic Games ended after more than 1,000 years of continuous celebration. When he died in 395, he left the east to his elder son Arcadius and the west to his younger son, Honorius. Both were boys. Both were dominated by their ministers. The two courts began almost at once to work against each other, and from that point, the histories of the two halves diverge sharply. And it is worth asking why the East lived when the West died. The answer is partly luck, and partly geography, and partly money. Geography first. The western frontier was the Rhine and the upper Danube, a long open line with flat country behind it and no natural fallback. When it broke, as it did in the winter of 406, when a great mixed group of peoples crossed the frozen Rhine, there was nothing to stop them until they reached the sea. The eastern frontier was different. The Danube was still there, but behind it, the Balkan mountains channeled invaders into predictable routes, and beyond that lay the Bosphorus. Asia Minor, Syria and Egypt, the wealthiest and most populous provinces of the whole Roman world, sat behind water. A raiding army could ruin Thrace and never touch them. Money next. The eastern provinces were simply richer. Egypt alone produced grain in quantities that could feed a great city, with plenty left over. Syria and Asia Minor had dense networks of prosperous towns making textiles, glass, olive oil and wine. The tax base of the East was deeper and more resilient than the West's, which depended heavily on the great landed estates of Gaul, Spain and North Africa, and when those provinces were lost, the Western treasury simply emptied. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western emperor could not pay his own army. The Eastern emperor could pay his, and could also pay other people's armies to go somewhere else, which turned out to be the single most useful thing an empire can buy. And then there were the walls. In 408, the Eastern throne passed to a child of 7, named Theodosius II, who would reign for 42 years and is remembered mostly for 2 things. He gathered the scattered imperial laws of the previous century into a single code, the first great Roman legal compilation. And his government built the land wall of Constantinople. It was the work of a praetorian prefect named Anthemius, and it was one of the finest pieces of military engineering ever executed. About 1.5 miles west of Constantine's older wall, they laid out a new line running from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, roughly 6.5 kilometers long. It was not one wall, but a system in depth. An attacker coming from the west first met a moat about 20 meters wide, which could be flooded. Behind the moat was a low breastwork. Behind that, a terrace, then an outer wall, about 8 meters high with its own towers. Behind that, another terrace, and then the inner wall, 12 meters high and 5 meters thick at the base, with 96 great towers rising to 20 meters, each within bowshot of its neighbors. A man standing on the inner wall could shoot over the heads of the men on the outer wall. An army that broke through the first line found itself in a killing ground, with archers above it on both sides. The masonry alternated bands of stone and brick, which looks decorative and is actually an earthquake precaution, giving the structure a little flexibility. And when a series of earthquakes did bring down large sections in 447 at the worst possible moment, with Attila and the Huns marching on the city, the population rebuilt it in about 2 months. The circus factions, the organised supporters of the chariot teams, provided the labour gangs. 16,000 men worked in shifts. An inscription set into one of the towers boasted that Athena herself could not have built it faster. Attila looked at what they had done and went to plunder somewhere else. So did everyone else for 1,000 years. No army took Constantinople by direct assault across those walls until gunpowder artillery existed, and even then it took cannon that were among the largest ever cast. The West had no such luck and no such wall. In 410, the Goths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. The shock ran through the Mediterranean world. In North Africa, a bishop named Augustine began writing a book to explain why the fall of an earthly city need not shake faith in an eternal one. Then came the slow amputation. North Africa, the western grain supply, was lost to the Vandals in 439. Britain had already been let go. Spain and Gaul passed piece by piece to Gothic, Frankish and Burgundian kings, who still, in theory, held their lands as Roman officers. The Western emperors of the 5th century became figureheads controlled by generals of barbarian descent, and were made and unmade with an indifference that suggests nobody thought the office mattered very much anymore. In 476, the last of them, a boy who had been put on the throne by his father, and given the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a commander named Odoacer, and Odoacer did not appoint a replacement. He sent the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople, with a message saying that one emperor was enough for the world, and asked to govern Italy in the Eastern Emperor's name. At the time, hardly anyone thought this was the end of anything. Italy still had a senate, consuls, taxes, aqueducts and games. Life went on. But something had happened, and the people in Constantinople understood it perfectly well. There was now one Roman emperor, and he lived on the Bosphorus. The Roman Empire had not ended. It had simply contracted to the half that could still afford itself. 50 years later, a peasant's nephew from the Latin-speaking hills of the Balkans sat on that throne, and decided to take the West back. His uncle had come to the city. As a young man walking from Illyria with a cloak and a bag of dry bread, had joined the palace guard, had risen through it by sheer competence, and in his 60s had found himself acclaimed emperor almost by accident. His name was Justin, and he could barely write. He had a stencil cut so that he could trace the shape of his own signature onto documents. But he had brought his nephew to the capital as a boy, and given him the education he had never had, and when Justin died in 527, the nephew was ready. His name was Petrus Sabatius, and history knows him by the name he took from his uncle, Justinian. He was not a soldier. In a reign of 38 years, he never once led an army in the field, which, for a Roman emperor, was extraordinary. He was an administrator and a theologian and an insomniac. His courtiers called him the Emperor who never sleeps, because the lamps in his study burned all night, while he read reports and drafted laws and argued about the two natures of Christ with anyone who would sit still. He ate little, drank almost nothing, and worked with a relentlessness that exhausted everyone around him, and he married an actress. Her name was Theodora, and by the standards of the Roman aristocracy, the match was close to unthinkable. Her father had been a bear keeper at the Hippodrome. She had grown up in the world of the stage, which in the 6th century meant a world of mime, dancing and prostitution, and she had worked in it. There was a law forbidding a senator to marry a woman of the theatre. Justinian had the law changed. Almost everything we know about her, personally, comes from a historian named Procopius, who wrote an official history of Justinian's wars. That is careful and detailed and largely reliable, and also wrote a private book, published only after his death. That is one of the most spectacular character assassinations ever committed to paper. In it, Justinian is a demon who walks the palace at night without a head, and Theodora is a monster of appetite and cruelty. Historians have argued about the secret history for 400 years. What is clear from every source, hostile or not, is that Theodora was extremely intelligent, that Justinian consulted her on everything, and that in the worst moment of his reign, she was the one who did not lose her nerve. That moment came in January of 532, 5 years into the reign, and it began at the races. To understand it, you have to understand the Hippodrome. It was the great oval racecourse beside the palace, 450 metres long, with room for tens of thousands of spectators, and it was the only place where the people of the city and the emperor met face to face. Chariot racing was not merely a sport there. The supporters were organised into factions named after the colours their teams wore, the blues and the greens. And these factions had real institutional life. They maintained the teams and the horses, staged the ceremonies, sometimes provided militia and work gangs, and functioned as something between a political party, a fan club, and a street gang. They had their own daffodils, and they had their own hairstyles and the wearing their sleeves. Tight at the wrist and enormous at the shoulder, young men from the factions robbed and murdered in the streets at night, and generally got away with it because emperors needed their acclamations. Justinian was known as a supporter of the blues, but in the winter of 531, his city prefect hanged members of both factions for murder, and the rope broke twice, and the crowd took that as a sign from heaven and sheltered the survivors in a church. When the emperor refused to pardon them, something unprecedented happened. The blues and the greens made common cause. At the races on the 13th of January, the two factions began chanting together, not for their teams but for mercy, and when no mercy came, the chant changed to a single word, Nika, conquer. It was the word you shouted at a chariot. Now they shouted it at the government. For 5 days the city burned. The rioters emptied the prisons, killed officials, and set fires that consumed the Senate House, the public baths, a hospital with the patients still inside, and the great church of Hagia Sophia, which was then a much smaller basilica of wood and stone built by Constantine's son. They found a nephew of a former emperor named Hypatius, dragged him out of his house despite his protests, and crowned him in the Hippodrome with a golden chain because they could not find a diadem. Justinian prepared to run. Ships were readied at the palace harbour with the treasury loaded aboard, and it was here, according to Procopius, that Theodora spoke, in a council where every man present had already decided to flee. She said that flight was always possible, that the sea was there, and the ships were there, but that she wondered whether a man who had been emperor could bear to live as a fugitive. And then she said the line that has followed her ever since, that the imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. They stayed. 2 generals, Belisarius and Mundus, brought loyal troops through the ruins by separate routes and entered the Hippodrome from 2 sides at once, into a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder with no way out. The killing went on until the sand was covered. Procopius says 30,000 died. Even if that number is doubled from the truth, it emptied the city of a generation of young men, and there were no serious riots in Constantinople for a very long time afterwards. Justinian walked out of the ashes into the freest hand any emperor had held in centuries, and he used it to rebuild. The greatest of those buildings still stands. He gave the commission for the new Hagia Sophia, not to an architect, but to 2 men trained as mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and he told them to build something that had never been built. What they produced was a rectangle roughly 70 metres by 70, with an enormous dome 31 metres across, stow set over a square space by means of curved triangular sections at the corners, so that the round dome seems to float above a room with straight walls. The dome was pierced around its base by 40 windows, and the effect of that ring of light is the whole point of the building. From below, the masonry above the windows seems to be resting on nothing at all. A courtier writing at the time said the dome seemed not to stand on solid masonry, but to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The walls were faced with marble cut and folded open, so that the veins made patterns like clouds, quarried from Egypt, from Thessaly, from the Bosphorus itself. There was so much gold in the mosaics that on a bright morning the interior seemed to be filled with a luminous fog. 5 years, 10 months and 4 days after the first stone, it was consecrated. Justinian is supposed to have walked into it and said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." It was too ambitious. The first dome was too shallow and the piers spread under its weight, and after 2 earthquakes, it collapsed in 558. Isidore's nephew rebuilt it steeper and heavier, and that dome, with later repairs, is the one standing now, 15 centuries later, in a city that has been hit by more than a dozen major earthquakes since. For nearly 1,000 years it was the largest enclosed space in the world. Ambassadors were brought to it deliberately at the hour when the light was best, as an argument. When the envoys of a prince of Kiev came looking for a religion in the 10th century, they reported back that in the Greek church they had not known whether they were on earth or in heaven. Whatever else the empire lost over the coming centuries, it always had that building, and it always knew what it was for. While the masons worked on the dome, Justinian's armies were trying to put the Roman world back together. The instrument of that attempt was a Thracian officer named Belisarius, who was about 30 when the reconquest began, and who is one of the few generals of any age who seems to have won consistently while being outnumbered almost every time. He fought with small, highly trained forces built around his own household troops. Heavily armoured horsemen, who could shoot a composite bow from the saddle and then charge with a lance. He avoided pitched battles when he could, and won them when he could not, and he had an unusual talent for making enemies destroy themselves through impatience. His first target was North Africa, held for a century by the Vandals, whose kings had grown comfortable in the villas of Carthage. Justinian's advisors told him it was madness, a host of golden daffodils. The treasury remembered the last attempt against the Vandals 70 years earlier, which had cost the Eastern Empire a fortune, and achieved nothing. But a usurpation had just weakened the Vandal court, and Belisarius sailed in the summer of 533 with about 15,000 men. The campaign took 3 months. He landed unopposed, marched on Carthage along the coast road, with the fleet keeping pace beside him, beat the Vandal army twice, and entered the city in time to eat the dinner that had been prepared in the royal palace for the Vandal king. The following spring he brought that king back to Constantinople in a triumph, the first triumph celebrated in the city, with the treasures of the Vandal palace carried through the streets, including the golden vessels that the Vandals had taken from Rome in 455, which the Romans had taken from Jerusalem 4 centuries before that. Italy was harder. Belisarius took Sicily in a summer, crossed to the mainland, and marched up to Rome, which he entered without a fight in December of 536. Then the Ostrogoths came back with a large army and besieged him there for a year and 9 days, and the campaign that everyone had expected to be short became a war of 20 years. That war destroyed Italy in a way that no barbarian invasion had. Rome changed hands 5 times. The aqueducts were cut and never fully restored, and the population of the city, which had still been perhaps 500,000 in the 5th century, fell to a few tens of thousands living among monuments they could no longer maintain. Famine emptied the countryside. When it was finally over, the exhausted Roman administration in Italy lasted just 15 years before a new people, the Lombards, walked in from the north and took most of the peninsula almost unopposed. Justinian did also recover a strip of southern Spain. And for a brief moment, in the middle of the 6th century, the map looked almost like the old empire again. The Mediterranean was once more a Roman lake, or close to it. But the cost had been enormous, and it had been paid by taxpayers in Syria, Egypt and Asia Minor who saw no benefit at all. Worse, the eastern frontier had been left thins, while the armies were in the west. And the Persian king Khosrow understood that perfectly. In 540, he came down the Euphrates and sacked Antioch, the third city of the empire, and deported its people to a new town he built for them near his capital, a copy of Antioch, complete with baths. And in the middle of all this, in the spring of 541, a ship carrying grain from Egypt docked at Pelusium, and something came ashore with the rats. It reached Constantinople the following spring, and the account we have of it is from Procopius, who was there. It began with fever and a listlessness that did not seem serious, and then swellings appeared in the groin and the armpits. Some victims fell into a deep coma, others became delirious and had to be watched constantly to stop them throwing themselves into water. Those whose swellings burst and drained sometimes lived, most did not. At its height, Procopius says, the city was losing 5,000 people a day, and then 10,000, and then more than anyone could count. The burial grounds filled. Bodies were carried up into the towers of the fortifications, across the Golden Horn, and thrown in until the towers were full, and the smell came across the water on the wind. Shops closed. Nobody was seen in the streets, except the men carrying the dead. The emperor himself caught it and survived, which nobody had expected. This was the first recorded appearance in Europe of bubonic plague, and modern DNA work on 6th century graves in Bavaria has confirmed the organism. It did not come once. It came back, roughly, every 10 to 15 years for the next 2 centuries, and each return killed a new generation of children who had no exposure. Estimates of the total loss vary enormously, and every honest historian admits the uncertainty. A host of golden daffodils, but the lowest serious figures still suggest that the eastern Mediterranean lost a quarter of its people, and the highest go far above that. What it did to the empire is easier to see than to measure. Fewer taxpayers meant less revenue, fewer men meant smaller armies and higher wages for the soldiers who remained. Fields went out of cultivation. Cities that had been growing for centuries stopped growing and began to shrink, and many of them would never recover their size. The great age of Mediterranean urban life, of colonnaded main streets and public baths and theatres in provincial towns, effectively ended in these decades. What came afterwards was more smaller, more defensive, more rural. Against that dark background, Justinian's other great project has lasted better than any of his conquests. Roman law by the 6th century was an unusable mess. There were imperial statutes going back centuries, many of them contradictory, and alongside them, a vast literature of commentary by jurists of the classical age whose opinions carried legal force. A judge faced with a difficult case might have to weigh the views of writers who had been dead for 300 years, and who disagreed. In 528, in his second year, Justinian appointed a commission under a brilliant and deeply unpopular official named Tribonian to fix it. They worked with astonishing speed. Within 14 months, they produced the code, a single collection of valid imperial legislation with the obsolete and contradictory material stripped out. Then they turned to the jurists, read some 2,000 books, and reduced 3 million lines of commentary to a 50th of that length, arranged by subject, in a work called the Digest. It took 3 years, and it should have taken 30. Alongside it, they produced the Institutes, a short textbook for first-year law students, which is so clear and well organized that it was still being used in European universities more than 1,000 years later. Together, these books are called the Corpus of Civil Law, and their influence is difficult to overstate. When the study of Roman law revived in Italy in the 11th century, it was this compilation that scholars read. Through them it shaped the legal systems of France, Spain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and everywhere those countries went afterwards. If you live in a country whose law is not descended from the English common law, you are living at some distance inside Justinian's filing system. He died in 565, aged 82, having outlived Theodora by 17 years and having reigned longer than any Roman emperor except Augustus. The empire he left was larger on the map than the one he had inherited and much weaker underneath. The treasury was empty. The plague was still circulating. The armies were stretched across 3,000 miles of frontier. In Italy, his reconquest was about to be undone. And on the Danube, new peoples were gathering. His successors spent the next 60 years trying to hold what he had taken, and slowly losing it. There is a case made by more than one historian that Justinian's Great Western War was the mistake that ruined the Eastern Empire's chances of holding its eastern provinces. There is also the counter case that no emperor who could reconquer Africa and Italy could have chosen not to try. What is certain is that within 75 years of his death, the empire would face something that made the Vandals and the Goths look like a local difficulty. The catastrophe began, as these things often do, with a murder inside the palace. In 602, the Emperor Maurice, a capable and thrifty man who had made himself hated by economizing on the army, ordered his troops on the Danube to spend the winter north of the river in enemy country rather than come home. They refused, marched on Constantinople instead, and proclaimed a junior officer named Phocas. Maurice was made to watch his 5 sons killed in front of him before he was killed himself, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. The Persian king, Khosrow II, had reason to care about this. As a young man, he had been driven from his own throne by a rebellion, and had fled to Roman territory, and Maurice had given him an army and put him back on it. He had called Maurice his father. Now he announced that he would avenge him, produced a young man who claimed to be one of Maurice's surviving sons, and invaded. What followed was the last war of antiquity, and the 2 empires that fought it had been fighting one another, in one form or another, for 700 years. This time they went at it as if they meant to finish it. The Persians took the frontier fortresses one by one. Then they took Syria. Then, in 614, they took Jerusalem after a siege of 3 weeks. And when the city fell, the slaughter went on for days, and the true cross, the most precious relic in the Christian world, was carried away to the Persian capital. Then they took Egypt, the granary, and the free bread distribution in Constantinople stopped for the first time since Constantine had begun it. Then they took Asia Minor, and Persian troops camped at Chalcedon, on the Asian shore, where the citizens of the capital could see their fires across the water at night. Meanwhile, the Avars, a steppe people, who had built a great confederation on the Hungarian plain, were rolling over the Balkan provinces with the Slavic peoples who moved under their protection. Cities that had stood since the age of Alexander vanished. By the 620s, the empire consisted, in practical terms, of Constantinople, some coastal enclaves, North Africa, and a few islands. Phocas was overthrown in 610 by the son of the governor of Africa, who sailed into the Golden Horn with a fleet whose masts were hung with icons. His name was Heraclius, and when the deposed emperor was dragged before him, Heraclius asked whether this was how he had ruled the state. Phocas is supposed to have replied, "Will you rule it better?" It was a fair question. For 12 years, the answer looked like no. Then Heraclius did something no emperor had done in 200 years. He took the field himself. He spent years preparing. He borrowed the treasure of the church, melting down plate and candlesticks with the patriarch's blessing and a promise of repayment, and struck it into coin to pay soldiers. He rebuilt and retrained the army from what was left. He made peace with the Avars at humiliating cost in tribute in order to free his hands. And then, in the spring of 622, he sailed east and began a campaign of 6 years that reads more like a raid on a continental scale than a war of positions. He did not try to recover the lost provinces province by province. He went around them. He landed in Asia Minor, marched through Armenia and the Caucasus, made allies of the Turkic Khazars on the steppe, and struck south into the Persian heartland, into the fire temple heartland of the Sasanian kings, attacking the places that mattered to Khosrow personally. The Persians answered with the boldest stroke of the war. In 626, a Persian army marched to Chalcedon, while an Avar army, with Slavic and Bulgar contingents, came down to the land walls, and the two agreed to combine and take the city. Heraclius, hundreds of miles away, refused to come back. He sent a few thousand men and a letter and continued east. The siege lasted 10 days. The Avars had siege towers and rams and enormous numbers, and the defenders had perhaps 12,000 soldiers on the walls. The critical point was the water. The Persians could not cross the Bosphorus because the imperial navy controlled it, and when the Avars tried to ferry Slavic troops across the Golden Horn in dugout canoes to attack the weak sea walls, the Roman warships fell on them and destroyed the flotilla completely. Without the Persian infantry, the assault on the land walls failed, and the Avar Khagan burned his machines and went home. His confederation never recovered its authority, and the Avars faded from history within 2 generations. The people of the city knew exactly who had saved them. Throughout the siege, the patriarch had carried an icon of the Virgin along the walls, and afterwards a great hymn of thanksgiving was sung standing. All night, in her honour. It is still sung in the Orthodox Church. From that year the Virgin was, in a sense that was entirely literal to those who lived there, the defender of the city. 2 years later, in the winter darkness near the ruins of Nineveh, Heraclius met the main Persian field army and destroyed it. He is said to have killed the Persian commander in single combat in front of both lines, which may be flattery, but he certainly fought in the ranks and took a wound to the lip. Then he marched on the royal palaces south of it and burned them. The Persian nobility had had enough. Khosrow was overthrown by his own son and executed in a cellar, and the new king sued for peace. Everything was returned: Egypt, Syria, Palestine, the frontier fortresses, and the true cross, which Heraclius carried back to Jerusalem in person in 630 and restored to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There is a story that he tried to enter the city on horseback in full imperial regalia, and the gate would not admit him until he dismounted and walked in barefoot in a plain robe. It is probably a later invention. It was believed for 1,000 years. He was 55 years old, and he had done what no one thought possible. He had beaten Persia so completely that it would never threaten Rome again. The last war of antiquity was over, and Rome had won it. Both empires were also wrecked. 2 decades of total war had drained treasuries that were already thin, burned farmland from the Nile to the Caspian, and killed a generation of soldiers on both sides. The frontier provinces had changed hands twice, and their populations had learned that neither empire could reliably protect them. In Syria and Egypt, where a majority of Christians held to an understanding of Christ's nature, that The government in Constantinople had spent a century condemning as heresy. Imperial rule had come back with tax collectors and doctrinal pressure, and the welcome was thin. Heraclius returned to his capital in triumph in 630. Within 4 years, reports began arriving from the desert frontier of raids by Arab tribes, which was not in itself unusual. What was unusual was that the tribes had stopped fighting each other. In 636, on a hot windy day, beside a tributary of the Yarmouk River, in what is now the borderland of Syria and Jordan, a large Roman army faced them. The sandstorm blew into Roman faces. The battle lasted 6 days. When it was over, the Roman field army of the east had ceased to exist. Syria was gone within 2 years. Jerusalem surrendered in 637 after a siege, and the Patriarch handed the keys to the Caliph Umar in person. Egypt fell between 639 and 642, and with it the wealthiest province the empire had: the grain, the linen, the papyrus, and the ancient churches of Alexandria. Persia did not fall province by province. It fell entirely, and within 20 years the empire that had fought Rome for 7 centuries simply did not exist anymore. Heraclius watched all of it. He was ill by then, with dropsy, and could not bear to cross water, so that when he finally had to return from Asia to his capital, they built a bridge of boats and lined it with branches on both sides so that he could not see the sea. He died in 641 in a city that had lost, in the last 5 years of his life, everything he had spent the previous 20 winning back. He had saved the empire, and he had also, without ever knowing it, presided over the end of the ancient world. What was left was a third of an empire, and it had to learn to live like one. The territory that remained was Asia Minor, the Aegean Islands, a strip of the Balkan coast, southern Italy and Sicily, and North Africa, which would be lost too before the century was out. The revenues had fallen by perhaps 3/4. The old professional field armies could no longer be paid in the old way. And the old civilian provincial administration, with its careful separation of military and civil authority that went back to Diocletian, could no longer be afforded either. So it changed, gradually, without any single reforming decree that we can point to. The surviving field armies were pulled back into Asia Minor and settled across large districts, and the districts came to be named after the armies stationed in them. The Greek word for these divisions was thema, and historians call the arrangement the theme system. The commanding general of the army in a theme became the governor of the theme. Soldiers were given land, or the right to the revenue of land, in return for the obligation to serve, and their sons inherited both the land and the obligation. It made the army much cheaper. It also rooted it in the countryside, so that when raiders came, the men defending the valley were defending their own farms. The way of fighting changed with it. There were no more great set-piece battles for the frontier, because the frontier was no longer a line. Arab raiding columns came over the Taurus Mountains through a handful of passes every summer, sometimes several thousand strong, and rode deep into Anatolia, burning and taking captives. The Roman response was not to meet them head-on. It was to shadow them, block the passes behind them, poison the wells on their route, strip the countryside of anything edible, and fall on them when they were strung out and loaded with plunder on the way home. The population learned to move into hill forts when the beacons were lit. A chain of signal fires ran from the Cilician frontier to the capital, and a message could cross Asia Minor in a few hours. Cities shrank into fortified citadels on hilltops. The open lower towns with their theatres and colonnades were abandoned. A manual of this kind of warfare survives, written in the 10th century and attributed to an emperor, and it is a cold, practical document about scouting, ambush, and never risking a battle you do not have to fight. It is the tactics of a state that knows it cannot replace its losses. Twice in this period, the Arabs came for the city itself, and twice the city held, and the second time it changed the history of Europe. The first great attempt ran from 674 to 678, a long campaign of blockade and repeated attacks by sea, with the Arab fleet wintering nearby and returning each spring. The second, in 717 and 718, was far more dangerous. A very large army, under the Caliph's brother, crossed into Europe and invested the land walls, while a fleet of hundreds of ships came up to close the straits. This time, the intention was clearly to finish the empire, and everyone understood it. The city survived through a combination of the walls, a hard winter that killed men and horses in the besieging camp, a Bulgar army that attacked the besiegers from behind. After the emperor brought their help, the desertion of Christian crews from the Arab fleet, and one other thing. It was called liquid fire, or sea fire, and the Romans guarded the secret of it so carefully that it is genuinely lost. A Syrian refugee named Kallinikos is credited with bringing the formula to Constantinople in the 7th century. It was a petroleum-based compound, probably drawn from natural seeps around the Black Sea, thickened with resins and other substances, and it was heated in a sealed bronze vessel until it was under pressure, and then pumped through a swivelling nozzle in the bow of a ship. The effect on wooden ships packed with men was total. It burned on the surface of the water. It stuck to whatever it touched. Water spread it rather than quenching it, and the sources say that only sand, vinegar, or old urine would put it out. Crews who saw it deployed, sometimes abandoned their ships without waiting to be hit. The empire treated the recipe as a state secret of the highest order, an emperor writing a book of advice for his son a century later, instructed him that if foreigners ever asked for it, he was to reply that it had been sent to Constantine the Great by an angel with a curse on anyone who gave it away, and that a man who had once tried to sell it had been struck by lightning in a church. Whether or not anyone believed the story, nobody ever wrote the formula down where we can read it, and the ingredients and proportions remain unknown. The siege of 718 broke. Of the huge fleet that had come, the sources claim only a handful of ships got home. It is one of those moments where it is fair to ask what would have followed if it had gone the other way. Because, with Constantinople gone, the road up the Danube into Central Europe stood open, and the Eastern Mediterranean would have had no Christian naval power in it at all. 14 years later, a Frankish commander stopped another Arab army near Poitiers in western France, and that battle is far more famous. The one at Constantinople was larger and mattered more. The emperor who held the city through that siege was a soldier from Syria named Leo, and having saved the empire militarily, he proceeded to tear it apart over a question about pictures. The empire was drenched in images, icons, painted panels of Christ, the Virgin and the saints were everywhere, in churches, in shops, in bedrooms, carried on campaign, set above city gates. People kissed them, lit lamps before them, and treated them as channels through which prayer travelled. Some went further. Icons stood as godparents at baptisms. Scrapings of paint were mixed into medicine and drunk. To a certain kind of mind, this looked exactly like what the Second Commandment forbids. And in the 720s, a great many people in the empire were asking a hard question. God had just given the world to the Arabs, who kept no images at all, and to the Jews, who kept none either. He had taken away Syria, Egypt and Africa from a people who filled their churches with painted faces. Was there a connection? In 726, a volcanic eruption in the Aegean, threw up pumice that fell on the decks of ships, and it was red as divine anger. Leo ordered the removal of a famous icon of Christ over one of the palace gates. The soldier who climbed the ladder to do it was pulled down and killed by a crowd of women. It was the beginning of more than a century of argument, called the iconoclast controversy, which means the breaking of images. For most of the 8th and 9th centuries, imperial policy swung between the two positions, and each swing brought exiles, beatings, confiscations, and the destruction of art. Monasteries, which were centres of icon devotion, were particular targets. Monks were paraded in the hippodrome and made to walk hand in hand with women to mock their vows. A prominent iconophile writer had verses branded onto his forehead with a hot iron. The mosaics of many churches were plastered over and replaced with plain crosses. The reversals came twice, and both times a woman on the throne made them. The Empress Irene, ruling for her young son, restored images at a council in 787. Iconoclasm returned in 815 under a soldier emperor who noticed that the iconoclast emperors had won battles and the icon-loving ones had lost them. And in 843, the Empress Theodora, another regent for a small boy, restored the icons for good. That restoration is still celebrated in the Orthodox Church every year on the first Sunday of Lent, and it is called the Triumph of Orthodoxy. What the Empire took from the whole exhausting business was a settled theology of the image, worked out with real philosophical care. That images are honoured but not worshipped, and that the honour passes through the image to the person shown. And it took something else. It had spent 120 years arguing about a religious question in a way that shows what kind of state it had become. Not a Mediterranean empire of many peoples and languages anymore, a smaller, harder, holy, Greek-speaking, holy Christian society, defending a shrinking coastline and utterly certain that it was the last correct thing left in the world. Let us stop the march of events for a while and walk around inside that world, because the Byzantines have left us enough to do it. Imagine arriving by sea, which is how most people came. Your ship comes up through the Sea of Marmara at first light, and the city appears on the right-hand side, spread along its promontory. And the first thing you notice is that it is built on hills, so that the domes rise one behind another in ranks. The sea walls run unbroken along the shore, and above them, catching the early sun, is the dome of Hagia Sophia with the gilded cross on top, visible from a long way out at sea. Sailors used it to take their bearings. The ship turns into the Golden Horn, and the water goes suddenly still, because the inlet is sheltered from every wind. There is a great chain that can be drawn across the entrance in wartime, floating on wooden barrels, and in peacetime it lies slack on the harbour bottom. The quays are crowded. There are Italian merchants from Amalfi, and later Venice and Genoa, Rus traders down from the northern rivers, with wax and honey and furs and slaves, Syrians, Jews, Armenians, Bulgars, Khazars. Foreign merchants are required to stay in designated quarters and to leave the city again within a fixed period, usually 3 months, and while they are here, they are watched by officials who record what they buy. Ashore, the city is smaller inside than it looks from the water. Constantine's walls enclosed a great deal of empty ground, and after the plagues and the sieges, much of the space between the built-up districts is orchards, vegetable gardens, vineyards and grazing. The population rises and falls dramatically across the centuries, perhaps 500,000 in Justinian's day, falling to something like 40,000 in the darkest years of the 8th century, climbing again to several 100,000 by the 12th. There are always ruins somewhere, and always building work somewhere else. The main street is called the Mies, which simply means the middle one. It runs from the Golden Gate in the land walls to the great square by the palace, colonnaded on both sides for much of its length, so that you can walk it in shade or out of the rain, and it opens at intervals into circular or oval forums with columns in the centre, carrying statues of dead emperors. Along it, the trades are grouped by law, perfumers here, because the smell is pleasant and the emperor's processions pass this way. Silversmiths there, candlemakers, saddlers, soap boilers and tanners are pushed to the edges of the city for obvious reasons. We know these details because a remarkable document survives, a 10th century regulation of the trade guilds, known as the Book of the Eparch being the city prefect. It reads like the bylaws of an extremely anxious municipality. Bakers may not be conscripted for public labour, because the city must always have bread. Grocers may take a profit of 2 coins in the 100 and no more. Notaries must know the law by heart, and must be of good character and free of chatter. Perfumers must set up their stalls in a row between the palace and a particular gate, and must not sell anything that smells bad. Silk merchants may not sell certain restricted colours or garments to foreigners at all. That last rule mattered enormously. Silk was the empire's most jealously guarded industry. For centuries, the raw thread came overland from China at ruinous prices, until, in the middle of the 6th century, 2 monks arrived at Justinian's court, claiming that they had lived in the Far East and knew how the stuff was made. They went back and returned with silkworm eggs hidden, according to the story, inside hollow bamboo canes, along with the knowledge that the worms must be fed on mulberry leaves. Within a generation, there were imperial workshops in Constantinople, Thebes and Corinth. The deepest purple, dyed with the secretion of a Mediterranean sea snail, in a process so laborious that thousands of shells produced a few grams of dye, was reserved for the imperial house. Children born to a reigning emperor in a particular chamber of the palace, lined with purple stone, were called porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, and it was the highest claim to legitimacy the empire had, at the heart of the city. Filling the whole eastern end of the promontory is the Great Palace, and it is not one building, but a sprawl of halls, chapels, courtyards, gardens and terraces descending to the sea, added to by every emperor for 7 centuries. It connects directly to the imperial box in the hippodrome, so that the ruler can appear before his people without walking in the street. Life inside it was governed by ceremony to a degree that is difficult to imagine. A 10th century emperor, Constantine VII, who was much happier writing books than governing, compiled a manual of court ritual that runs to hundreds of pages and specifies what everyone wears, where everyone stands, and what is chanted on every feast of the year. He explains in the preface that ceremonial order is the mirror of the harmony of the universe, and that without it, the empire would be shapeless and undignified. Ambassadors were received in a hall where the throne stood flanked by gilded bronze lions and a golden tree, with mechanical birds in its branches. When the visitor prostrated himself, the birds sang, the lions beat the ground. The throne, when he raised his head, the throne had risen towards the ceiling with the emperor, now dressed in different robes. An Italian bishop named Liutprand of Cremona described all this in the 10th century, and he was a hostile witness who found the Greeks ridiculous, and even he admits he was impressed the first time. Around the emperor moved the eunuchs. They were not slaves, and they were not marginal. Castration was a career path, and families of good standing sometimes had a son castrated deliberately. because a eunuch could rise to the highest offices of state and church without ever being able to found a dynasty, which made him safe. Eunuchs commanded armies, ran the treasury, and served as patriarchs. There was a formal hierarchy of court titles reserved for them. Outside the palace, ordinary life went on in a way that would be broadly recognizable to anyone who has lived in a Mediterranean city. People ate a great deal of bread, olives, cheese, beans, and fish. Meat was for feast days for most families. There was a fermented fish sauce inherited from the ancient world that went into almost everything. Wine was watered. The rich imported apples from Asia Minor, packed in straw, bathing continued long after it had died out in Western Europe. Though the great public bathhouses shrank into smaller neighbourhood establishments. There were hospitals, and they were remarkable for their time. A 12th century foundation charter for a monastery hospital in the capital survives, and it lists 50 beds divided into wards by type of illness, with separate wards for women, a surgical ward, resident physicians who worked in shifts, a pharmacy, and instructions on the diet to be provided. There were also orphanages and homes for the elderly, funded by imperial and private charity, on a scale not matched in Europe for many centuries. And there was the church, everywhere, structuring the year. The great festivals emptied the workshops, processions wound through the streets between churches on saints. Sometimes, several times a week, with the emperor himself walking in some of them. Relics were the city's other great treasure, accumulated over centuries by gift, purchase and confiscation, until Constantinople held what was believed to be the crown of thorns, the lance, pieces of the true cross, the robe of the Virgin, the head of John the Baptist, and a great deal more besides. Pilgrims came from everywhere to see them. Above all, there was the sense, constant and unembarrassed, of living in the last true city. The Byzantines called their capital simply the city, with no further description needed, and everyone in the eastern Mediterranean knew what was meant. In Slavic languages it became Sargrad, the emperor's city. In Arabic it was Al-Qustantinia, and there was a saying attributed to the prophet that whoever took it would be blessed, which is why so many tried. It was a city that believed, quite sincerely, that its walls were held up by prayer as much as by mortar, that its emperor was appointed by God, and that the correct performance of a hymn was a matter of imperial security. That belief was not a decoration on top of the political order. It was the political order. There is one more part of that world to walk through before the story moves on, and it is the part the Byzantines themselves would have said mattered most. Beyond the city walls, out in the hills and the deserts, and on the rocky islands, lay the monasteries, and there were a great many of them. Monasticism had begun in the Egyptian desert. In the 3rd century, when men and a good number of women went out past the last cultivated field to live alone, and by the 6th century it had spread across the whole eastern Mediterranean and taken on every possible form. There were hermits living singly in caves. There were communities of hundreds sharing meals and work and prayer under an abbot. There were men who lived in the hollow trunks of trees, and men who wandered without any fixed home, and, most famously, men who lived on the tops of pillars. The first of those was Simeon, a Syrian shepherd's son, who in the 5th century climbed onto a column near Aleppo to escape the crowds who came to see him, and stayed up there, on a platform a few square meters in size, for 37 years. The crowds only grew. Pilgrims came from Gaul and Persia. Emperors wrote to him for advice. He gave judgments on local disputes, preached twice a day, and prayed by bowing repeatedly from the waist, so many times that a visitor who tried to count gave up after more than 1,000. He was imitated for centuries. there were still men on pillars in the 12th century. To a modern reader, this can look like an eccentric fringe. It was nothing of the kind. Monks were the most respected people in Byzantine society, and monasteries were among its most important institutions. They owned enormous quantities of land and farmed it efficiently. They ran the hospitals and the orphanages. They copied the manuscripts. They were the reservoir from which bishops were drawn, since the higher clergy were required to be celibate, and parish priests generally were not. And their prayers were understood to be doing real work, holding back real dangers, in a way that a modern reader has to make an imaginative effort to take seriously, but which everyone at the time did. They were also the empire's most reliable opposition. Monks could not be bribed with office and were hard to threaten with anything an emperor could take away. It was monks who resisted iconoclasm for 100 years and paid for it with exile and mutilation. It was monks who broke the union with Rome twice, in the 13th century and again in the 15th, by simply refusing to accept it and persuading their congregations to refuse as well. More than one emperor discovered that a determined abbot with a reputation for holiness was harder to deal with than an army. The greatest concentration of them grew up on a peninsula in northern Greece, a long finger of land running out into the Aegean and ending in a mountain that rises more than 2,000 meters straight out of the sea. It is called Mount Athos, and hermits had settled there by the 9th century. In 963, the Emperor Nikephoros Phocas, who had wanted to be a monk himself and never quite escaped the wish, gave land and money to a friend named Athanasios to found the first organized community there, the Great Lavra. It grew. Within a century, there were dozens of houses. They came from everywhere in the Orthodox world: Greek, Georgian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Russian, each with its own buildings and its own language. And they still do. The peninsula has been self-governing for more than 1,000 years, under every government that has claimed it: Byzantine, Ottoman, Greek. 20 monasteries remain, with hermits scattered in huts along the cliffs between them. Women have been forbidden to set foot there since the 10th century. And so, according to the rule, have female animals, though nobody has ever managed to explain this to the cats. It is the oldest surviving monastic republic on Earth, and it holds a library of Greek and Slavonic manuscripts, second to none, and it is, in the most literal sense, a living fragment of the Byzantine Empire that never fell. What went on inside those walls shaped the empire's whole idea of what a human being is for. The Eastern tradition did not think of salvation primarily as a legal transaction, a debt paid and a sentence lifted, which is the way Western theology increasingly framed it. It thought of it as transformation. The word used is theosis, and it means becoming godlike, being gradually filled with divine life until human nature is remade by it. A 4th century bishop put it in a formula that was quoted for 1,000 years afterwards. God became man, so that man might become God, the method by which monks pursued that was prayer of a specific and demanding kind. Sit still. Lower the head. Breathe slowly. Repeat a single short prayer, the Jesus prayer, over and over until the words sink below thought and the mind becomes quiet. The Greek word for that stillness is hesychia, and the practitioners were called hesychasts. In the 14th century, while the empire was falling apart politically, this practice became the subject of the last great theological controversy in Byzantine history. A learned Greek from southern Italy named Balaam heard the monks of Athos describing what they experienced in prayer. An uncreated light that some of them said they saw, the same light the apostles were held to have seen on the mountain of the Transfiguration. He said it was absurd God is beyond all human knowing. Nobody sees God. The monk's defender was Gregory Palamas, himself a monk of Athos, and later Archbishop of Thessalonica, and his answer was subtle and has been influential ever since. He distinguished between God's essence, which is indeed utterly unknowable and always will be, and God's energies, the activity by which God reaches into creation, which are fully divine and genuinely encountered. The light the monks saw was not a created glow, and not the divine essence, but the energy of God, and it could be experienced by a human being still living in a body. The councils of the Church backed Palamas in 1341 and again in 1351, and hesychasm became and remains the mainstream of Orthodox spirituality. It spread from Athos into Russia and the Balkans, and the anthology of hesychast writings compiled in the 18th century is still one of the most widely read spiritual books in the Orthodox world. It is a strange and rather beautiful fact that in the same decades when the empire was losing its last cities, its monks were producing a theology that outlasted the state by centuries and is being practiced now. The texture of ordinary religious life ran alongside all of this and was less rarefied. People wanted results. They went to shrines to be cured, sleeping overnight in the church in the hope of a healing dream, a practice inherited more or less directly from the pagan temples of Asclepius that had done the same thing. They wore small enamel or lead amulets stamped with saints. They took oil from the lamps burning in front of icons and rubbed it on wounds. They wrote curses on lead sheets and buried them, which the church condemned repeatedly and unsuccessfully for 1,000 years, which tells us how common it was. They had a saint for everything. Saint Nicholas for sailors, and there were a great many sailors. Saint Barbara against sudden death, Saints Cosmas and Damian for medicine, who took no fees. The two great warrior saints, George and Demetrios, painted on horseback in red cloaks, were expected to appear in person at critical moments in battle, and after several sieges soldiers reported that they had. And above them all was the Virgin, who was not merely honoured in Constantinople, but held to be its actual proprietor. Her robe was kept in a church by the Golden Horn, and it was carried around the walls in procession when enemies came. After the failure of the Great Siege of 626, the population credited her personally, not the general who commanded, and not the emperor who was 1,000 miles away. Her image was on the city gates, on the coins, on the banners. When the city finally fell, 8 centuries later, a chronicler wrote that the Mother of God had at last withdrawn her protection, and that everyone had known for some time that she would, because of what the people had done and failed to do. It did not occur to him to doubt that the arrangement had been real. That was how they saw the world, from the emperor in his purple down to the fisherman on the sea wall, and no account of the empire makes sense without it. In the year 867, a peasant from the Thracian countryside murdered his way to the throne and founded the most successful dynasty the empire ever had. His name was Basil, and his rise is so improbable that if it were fiction, no one would accept it. He was born to a family of Armenian descent, settled in the Balkans, so poor that he walked to Constantinople as a young man with nothing. He was enormously strong, and he found work breaking horses, which brought him to the attention of a nobleman, who brought him to the attention of the emperor, Michael III. Michael liked him. Basil made himself indispensable, arranged the murder of the emperor's powerful uncle, was crowned co-emperor, and then one night, when Michael was drunk, had him killed too. It was a squalid beginning. What followed was a dynasty that lasted 190 years, presided over the most successful period in the empire's later history, and produced its finest scholarship, its greatest conquests since Justinian, and a cultural reach that outlived the empire itself by 1,000 years. Some of that reach was accidental, and some of it was deliberate. In the 860s, before Basil took power, a Moravian prince in Central Europe had asked Constantinople for missionaries who could teach in a language his people understood. The government sent 2 brothers from Thessalonica, Constantine, who took the monastic name Cyril, and Methodius. They were exceptional scholars, and instead of simply preaching in Greek, they did something much more ambitious. They devised an entirely new alphabet, capable of representing the sounds of Slavic speech, and translated the scriptures and the liturgy into it. The Moravian mission ultimately failed, squeezed out by German clergy who preferred Latin, but the alphabet did not fail. Their pupils were driven south into Bulgaria, where they were welcomed, and there the script was refined into the form now called Cyrillic, in honour of the elder brother. From Bulgaria it travelled to Serbia and to the Rus of Kiev, and it is the script in which several 100 million people write today. The Bulgarians were the empire's nearest and most dangerous neighbours, a Turkic ruling elite over a Slavic population occupying much of the Balkans. In 864, their ruler Boris accepted Christianity from Constantinople rather than Rome, after some skillful playing off of the two against each other, and the whole northern Balkans entered the Byzantine cultural orbit. It did not make them friendly. His son Simeon had been educated in Constantinople, spoke perfect Greek, and spent most of his reign trying to take the city and make himself emperor of the Romans and the Bulgarians. He never took it, but he came close enough that in 913 a regency government had to receive him outside the walls and put an imperial crown of some sort on his head to make him go away. The greater conversion came in 988, and it came through a marriage that scandalized the court. Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev, was a pagan ruler of a vigorous state, built on the river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea, whose ancestors had raided Constantinople more than once, arriving suddenly out of the north in fleets of small boats. The Emperor Basil II, in serious trouble in a civil war, needed soldiers badly, and Vladimir had them. The price Vladimir asked was the Emperor's sister Anna in marriage, which was outrageous, because the imperial family did not marry barbarians, and a princess born in the purple was the most exclusive commodity the empire possessed. Basil was desperate enough to agree, on condition that Vladimir be baptized. Vladimir was baptized, married Anna, threw the idols of Kiev into the river, and had his people baptized in the Dnieper in batches. There is a famous story, written down a century later, of how he sent envoys to examine the faiths, and how they rejected Islam because it forbade wine, and Judaism because its people had lost their land and came back from the Church of Hagia Sophia, unable to describe what they had seen, except to say that they had not known whether they were in heaven or on earth. Whether or not any of that happened, the consequences did. Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are Orthodox countries today because of a bargain struck between a Kievan prince and a Byzantine emperor who needed troops. Those troops became the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard for the next 4 centuries. Recruited from Scandinavians and Rus, and later from Anglo-Saxons who had left England after the Norman conquest. They carried long axes on their right shoulders. They were paid extremely well, and they had the traditional right to help themselves from the treasury when an emperor died, walking through it once and taking what they could carry. They were loyal precisely because they were foreign. With no families and no factions in the city, a Norwegian named Harald Hardrada served in the guard for a decade, made a fortune, went home to be King of Norway, and died in England in 1066, trying to take another throne. Meanwhile, the frontier was moving forward for the first time in 300 years. The Arab world had fragmented. The Caliphate in Baghdad had lost effective control of its western provinces, and the empire's professional armies, now built around heavily armoured cavalry, were better equipped and better commanded than anything they faced. From the 920s onwards, the Byzantines went from raiding to conquering. The two greatest soldiers of the age were remarkable men. Nikephoros Phokas was an ascetic who slept on the floor on a bearskin, wore a hair shirt under his armour, and after his brother's death vowed to abstain from meat. He was also utterly ruthless in the field and adored by his troops, who acclaimed him emperor in 963. He took Crete back after more than a century of Arab rule, breaking a nest of pirates that had made the Aegean unsafe for generations, and then took Cyprus, and then Cilicia, and then Antioch, which had been lost since 638. He was murdered in his bedchamber in 969 by a conspiracy that included his own wife and his brilliant nephew by marriage. John Tzimiskes, a small, red-haired, immensely energetic soldier who could reportedly leap onto a horse in full armour. Tzimiskes took the throne, exiled the empress, and then went on campaigning, driving deep into Syria and Palestine, close enough to Jerusalem that he wrote home boasting about it. And then came Basil II, the man who had bought the Rus alliance, and who is generally reckoned the ablest emperor after Justinian. He came to the throne as a boy, was dominated for years by a eunuch chamberlain, and then, at about 30, took control and never let go of it again. He spent his life in the field. He did not marry. He had no interest in ceremony, wore a plain dark robe, ate soldiers' food, and was said to be uneasy in the palace. He crushed two great revolts by the landed military aristocracy of Asia Minor, the families whose private wealth and private retainers threatened to turn the empire into a collection of principalities. And then he legislated against them, ordering the great estates to return land, bought from peasant villages, in some cases without compensation, going back decades. His long war was with Bulgaria, and it lasted almost 30 years. It was not glamorous. It was a grinding campaign of fortress-taking, valley by valley, year after year, and he was patient in a way that few commanders have ever been. In 1014 he trapped a Bulgarian army in a mountain pass and captured, the sources say, 14,000 men. What he did next gave him his name. He had them blinded, 99 out of every 100 completely, and every 100th man left with one eye to lead the others home. The column of the blind found its way back to the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel, who looked at them, suffered a stroke, and died 2 days later. Bulgaria surrendered 4 years afterwards, and for the first time since the 6th century the empire's frontier stood on the Danube again. He is called Basil the Bulgar, Slayer, and when he died in 1025, he left a state that ran from the Danube to Syria, from the Adriatic to Armenia, with a full treasury, a strong army, and a reputation that made its neighbours careful. It was as strong as it had been in 400 years. 50 years later, almost all of it in the east was gone. The collapse, when it came, was not caused by any single disaster, though there was a disaster, and it has become the date that everyone remembers. It was caused by 50 years of the empire quietly disarming itself. Basil II left no son. The throne passed to his brother, then to his brother's daughters, then through a sequence of husbands and favourites and short-lived emperors, 11 of them in 56 years, the civil aristocracy of the capital. The families of officials and lawyers and courtiers took control of the government and used it to weaken the military aristocracy of the provinces that Basil had spent his life fighting. That was understandable politics. The method was ruinous. They cut the army. Soldiers holding land in return for service were allowed, and then encouraged, to commute that service into a cash payment instead, daffodils. The money went into the treasury, and the men stayed on their farms, and the government hired mercenaries with the proceeds, which looked efficient on a ledger. In 1053, the entire standing force in Armenia, 50,000 men according to one source, was demobilized in favor of attacks. Armenia was the shield of eastern Anatolia. They also debased the coinage. The gold solidus, struck at the same weight and fineness since Constantine, had been the dollar of the medieval Mediterranean for 700 years, accepted from Ireland to Sri Lanka precisely because it never changed. In the middle of the 11th century it began to be diluted, and within 30 years its gold content had fallen by 2/3. The empire's greatest single asset, its reputation for reliability, was spent to cover deficits. At exactly this moment, two new forces arrived on opposite frontiers. In the west, Norman adventurers, younger sons from Normandy, who had come south as mercenaries and stayed as conquerors, began taking the Byzantine provinces of southern Italy. In 1071, the last imperial stronghold there, the port of Bari, fell after a 3-year siege, and 5.5 centuries of Roman rule in Italy ended. In the east came the Seljuk Turks. They were a family of the Oghuz Turks from Central Asia who had moved into Persia, converted to Islam, taken Baghdad in 1055, and made themselves the effective rulers of the Muslim East. Their armies were mostly light horse archers, mobile, fast and difficult to catch, and along with the disciplined Seljuk forces came a much larger and less controllable flow of Turkmen nomads who simply drifted west looking for grazing and plunder, and who could not be negotiated with because no one commanded them. And in the middle of it, the church split. The eastern and western halves of Christendom had been growing apart for centuries, and the reasons were more cultural than doctrinal. The Greek East had 5 ancient patriarchates, and a tradition of settling things in council. The Latin West had one great see, and a papacy that was, by the 11th century, asserting a claim to direct authority over the whole church. There were differences in practice that mattered enormously to people at the time. The West used unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and the East used leavened. Western clergy were increasingly required to be celibate. Easterns perished. Priests married. And there was the filioque, a single word added in the West to the Nicene Creed, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, which the East regarded as an unauthorized alteration to a creed agreed by a council of the whole church. In 1054, a papal delegation arrived in Constantinople to negotiate an alliance against the Normans, led by a cardinal named Humbert, a man of exceptional rigidity. The patriarch, Michael Kerolarios, was no more flexible. Talks went badly. On the 16th of July, Humbert walked into Hagia Sophia during the liturgy and laid a document of excommunication on the altar, then walked out and shook the dust from his feet. The patriarch excommunicated him in return. Both men had probably succeeded their authority, and the pope in whose name Humbert acted had in fact been dead for months. Contemporaries did not think the world had changed, but nothing was ever repaired, and the year 1054 has become the conventional date of the Great Schism between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West. Its practical consequence was that when the empire desperately needed Western help, the help came with conditions attached about who was in charge of God. 17 years later came Manzikert. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was a soldier who had come to the throne by marrying the widow of his predecessor, and he understood that the eastern frontier was disintegrating. In the spring of 1071, he assembled a very large army, perhaps 40,000 men, and marched east into Armenia to retake 2 fortresses and force the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan to a decisive battle. The army was a mixture. There were the old regular units, underpaid and under-strength. There were Armenian infantry, Frankish knights, Turkish mercenaries of the same stock as the enemy, and Pecheneg horse archers from the steppe. Its officers included men whose families wanted the emperor to fail. Alp Arslan was in Syria and did not want this battle at all. He turned back north, and in August the 2 armies met near the fortress of Manzikert, north of Lake Van. The Sultan offered terms. Romanos, having come this far with an army he could not afford to keep in the field, refused them. The battle was a disaster of manoeuvre rather than slaughter. The Turks would not stand and fight. They gave ground all day, shooting from the flanks, drawing the Roman line forward across the plain. When evening came, and Romanos ordered the withdrawal back to camp, the signal was misunderstood or deliberately misused. The rearguard, commanded by Andronikos Doukas, a member of the family that had most to lose from a victorious emperor, turned and marched away from the field, announcing that the emperor was dead. The line broke apart. The Turks came in on the gaps. Romanos fought until his horse was killed, and he was wounded, and he was taken prisoner. What happened next is the strangest part of the story. Alp Arslan treated him with elaborate courtesy, kept him for a week, and released him on terms that were, by the standards of the age, mild, involving a ransom, an alliance, and the return of certain fortresses. He seems to have wanted a stable, weakened neighbour, not a vacuum. He got a vacuum. Romanos returned to find that the Doukas family had deposed him and crowned someone else. He raised troops, was defeated, surrendered on a promise of safety, and was blinded so brutally with an unskilled hand that the wounds became infected. He died in agony a few days later, on an island in the Marmara, and the treaty died with him, with no emperor able to honour any agreement, and with the empire falling into a decade of civil war in which rival claimants hired troops against each other and paid them with permission to settle. Anatolia simply dissolved. The nomads came through the passes and did not go home. There was no field army left to stop them, because it had been demobilized 20 years earlier and then broken at Manzikert. Towns held out and were bypassed. Farmland became pasture, Greek-speaking, Christian Asia Minor. The heartland that had fed and manned the empire for 400 years was lost in about a decade, and a Seljuk Sultanate established its capital at Nicaea, 90 miles from Constantinople, in the city where the first great council of the church had met. That is the reason Manzikert is remembered as it is. As a battle, it was not especially bloody. As a hinge, it turned everything. It is the moment when Anatolia began to become Turkey, and it is not an exaggeration to say that the modern map of the eastern Mediterranean starts there. By 1081, the empire had lost most of Asia Minor, all of Italy, and much of the Balkans to Serbian and Pecheneg incursions. The currency was worthless, the treasury was empty, and a Norman army under Robert Guiscard, a man who had begun life as a bandit in Calabria, was crossing the Adriatic with the announced intention of taking Constantinople. Into that, at the age of 24, stepped a young general from one of the great military families, and the empire got one more long lease of life. His name was Alexios Komnenos, and we know him unusually well, because his daughter wrote a book about him. Anna Komnene was born in the Purple Chamber in 1083, was educated in philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and the Greek classics, and in her 60s having been forced into a convent after a failed attempt to take the throne for her husband, sat down and composed a history of her father's reign in 15 books. It is called the Alexiad, and it is the first substantial work of history written by a woman in Europe. It is partisan, it weeps openly for her father, and it is one of the most valuable and readable sources of the entire Middle Ages. Alexios seized power in 1080-81 in the usual way, by marching on the capital with an army, and his troops sacked the city they were supposedly liberating, for which the patriarch made him do public penance. He then spent about 20 years fighting for survival, and his method was rarely the direct one. He had no money and few soldiers. What he had was patience, an inexhaustible willingness to negotiate, and a talent for finding somebody else to fight his enemies. Against the Normans, who beat him badly in the field, he bought the Venetians. Venice had a superb fleet and wanted trading privileges, and Alexios gave them privileges of a kind no foreign power had ever received: exemption from customs duties throughout the empire, and their own quarter on the Golden Horn. The Venetian navy cut the Norman supply lines, and the invasion collapsed when Robert Guiscard died of fever. It was a brilliant short-term solution and a catastrophic long-term one. Within a century, Italian merchants dominated the empire's carrying trade, paid nothing for the privilege, and were hated by the population for it. Against the Pechenegs, a steppe people who came over the Danube in force and nearly destroyed him, he hired the Cumans, another steppe people, and in 1091 at Levunion, the two together annihilated the Pecheneg host. So completely, women and children included, that a Byzantine writer noted grimly that a whole people had perished in a single day. He rebuilt the coinage on a new footing, with a genuinely good gold coin at the top of a graded system. He reorganized the army around foreign mercenaries and the retinues of great families, granting them the revenues of estates in return for service. And having stabilized things, he wrote to the West, asking for soldiers. He wanted a few thousand professional mercenaries, of the kind the Empire had been hiring for decades, to help him take back the coastal parts of Asia Minor while the Seljuks were divided. What arrived was something else entirely. In 1095, at a council at Clermont in France, Pope Urban II preached a sermon calling on the knighthood of the West to go to the aid of the Eastern Christians and to liberate Jerusalem, promising spiritual reward to those who went. The response was enormous and completely uncontrolled. The first wave to arrive was not an army at all, but a mass of poor pilgrims. Following a preacher called Peter the Hermit, tens of thousands of them, who had already massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland on the way. Alexios shipped them across the Bosphorus to get them out of his city, advised them to wait, and they did not wait. They were destroyed by the Turks almost immediately. Then came the real thing, great lords with their own armies, among them Bohemond, the son of Robert Guiscard, who had personally invaded the empire 10 years earlier, and whose arrival must have made Alexios's blood run cold. The emperor handled them with enormous care. He fed them, gave them lavish presents, kept them moving so they never concentrated in one place near his capital, and extracted from each leader an oath to restore to the empire any territory taken that had formerly been Roman. Anna Komnene's description of these Western lords is one of the great passages of medieval writing, a mixture of fascination and distaste. She thought them physically magnificent, greedy, incapable of keeping their word, and impossible to shut up. She describes one knight sitting down on the imperial throne itself, out of sheer ignorance of what it was. The crusade worked, which nobody expected. Nicaea fell in 1097, and was handed over to the empire as agreed. The Crusaders then fought their way across Anatolia, took Antioch after a terrible siege, and captured Jerusalem in 1099. Alexios, following behind, recovered the whole western and northern coast of Asia Minor. But the alliance soured almost at once. Bohemond kept Antioch for himself rather than returning it, arguing that the emperor had failed to bring the relief army he had promised. The Crusaders came to believe that the Greeks were treacherous, effeminate and unreliable, more interested in negotiating with Muslims than fighting them. The Byzantines came to believe that the Franks were violent, faithless, and impossible to control, more interested in carving out lordships than in anything they had sworn. Both views contained a good deal of truth. The resentment festered for 100 years, and then it burst. Alexios died in 1118 after a reign of 37 years, and his son and grandson kept the recovery going. John II was, by common consent, the most personally decent man ever to occupy the throne, so gentle that he was said never to have condemned anyone to death or mutilation in 25 years, and a relentless campaigner who spent almost his entire reign in the field, pushing the frontier back. He died in his 50s in a hunting accident in Cilicia, cut by a poisoned arrow from his own quiver. His son Manuel I was a different kind of ruler entirely. He was tall, dark, athletic, fascinated by the West, and he loved everything the Crusaders did. He held jousting tournaments which the Byzantine court found bizarre and slightly obscene. He entered the lists himself. He married 2 Western wives. He practiced medicine as a hobby, and personally set the broken leg of a visiting king. He was extravagant, energetic, and probably the last emperor who could plausibly imagine restoring the empire to something like its old position. He fought in Italy, in Hungary, in Serbia, in Syria. He made the Crusader states of the Levant into clients. He entered Antioch in triumph in 1159 with the Prince of Antioch, walking beside his horse. He tried to negotiate the reunion of the churches with Rome, on terms nobody could accept, and in 1176, in a wooded pass called Myriokephalon, on the road to the Seljuk capital, he walked his army into an ambush and lost his siege train and much of his baggage, and had to accept terms. It was nothing like Manzikert in scale, and the army came home mostly intact. But Manuel himself compared it to Manzikert in a letter, and everyone understood what it meant. Anatolia was not coming back. The interior of Asia Minor was Turkish now, permanently, and the empire would have to live as a power of the coasts and the Balkans. Manuel died in 1180, leaving an 11-year-old son and a Latin mother as regent in a capital where perhaps 60,000 Italian merchants and their households now lived, exempt from tax, rich and detested. 2 years later, the city rose against them. The massacre of the Latins in 1182 was thorough and horrible. The Italian quarters were burned, and men, women, children, the sick in a hospital, and a papal legate were killed, and the survivors were sold into slavery to the Turks. Perhaps tens of thousands died, though the figures are uncertain. Those who escaped by ship raided the Aegean coasts on their way home in revenge. Everything that happened 22 years later has its roots in that day. The West did not forget it, neither did Venice. The Fourth Crusade was never meant to go anywhere near Constantinople. It was meant to go to Egypt. It was preached in 1198 by Pope Innocent III, and the plan was strategically sensible. Jerusalem had been retaken by Saladin 11 years earlier, and the Crusader states clung to a strip of coast. Egypt was the source of Muslim power in the region, so the crusade would strike there first. The lords who took the cross were mostly French, and they made a decision that destroyed the whole enterprise. before it began. Rather than march overland, they would go by sea. And since they had no ships, they sent envoys to Venice. The Venetians agreed to build and crew a fleet to carry 33,500 men and 4,500 horses for a fixed price of 85,000 silver marks, an immense sum, with the Republic taking half of any conquests. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was well over 80 and blind, and he was one of the most formidable political minds of the age. Venice suspended almost all other commercial activity for a year to build the fleet. They delivered it on time and complete, and then only about a third of the expected crusaders turned up. Many had made their own arrangements from other ports. The men who did arrive at Venice could not raise anything close to the sum owed, even after handing over their plate and jewellery, and they were camped on a sandy island in the lagoon, entirely dependent on the Venetians for food and water, with a debt they could not pay. Dandolo made an offer. Venice would suspend the debt if the Crusaders would first help recover a port on the Dalmatian coast called Zara, which had rebelled against Venetian control and put itself under the King of Hungary. Zara was a Christian city, and its king had taken the cross himself, and the Pope forbade the attack absolutely and threatened excommunication. The crusade attacked it anyway in November of 1202 and sacked it and wintered there. Into that winter camp came a young man with a proposition. His name was Alexios Angelos, and he was the son of a Byzantine emperor who had been deposed and blinded by his own brother. He had escaped to the west and had been shopping his cause around the courts of Europe. His offer to the Crusaders was extraordinary. Take me to Constantinople, put me on my father's throne, and I will pay you 200,000 silver marks, provision the army for a year, join the crusade personally with 10,000 men, maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land permanently, and submit the Greek Church to Rome. It was a fantasy. He was a young man with no following in his own country, and no conception of what the imperial treasury actually contained. But he made it plausibly, and the Crusaders were broke and stranded, host golden daffodils, and there was a widespread Western belief that the Greeks were faithless anyway, and that the usurper in Constantinople had no right to the throne. A minority in the army refused outright and left. The rest sailed east. They arrived in June of 1203, and the sight of the city struck them silent. One of the leaders, Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who wrote an account of the whole affair, says that the men could not believe there could be so rich a city in the world, and that they looked at the high walls and the towers and the palaces and shivered, because they understood what they had taken on. The city should have been impregnable. It was defended by a garrison that included the Varangian Guard, and it had held off far larger forces. But the reigning emperor, Alexios III, was a man of no capacity whatever. The navy had been allowed to rot to almost nothing, its funds embezzled by an admiral who was the emperor's brother-in-law, and who had sold off the anchors and rigging. When the Crusaders forced the chain across the Golden Horn and attacked the weaker sea walls from ships, there was no fleet to stop them. The emperor led a large army out of the land walls, faced the Crusader line, and then rode back inside without fighting. That night, he took 10,000 pieces of gold and the crown jewels and fled the city. The blind old emperor Isaac was brought up out of prison and restored, and his son was crowned beside him as Alexios IV. And then the bill came due. He could not pay it. He stripped the churches, taking icons and reliquaries and melting them down, which horrified his own people. And it was still not enough. Meanwhile, the Crusader army sat outside the walls through the autumn and winter, growing hungrier and angrier and relations broke down completely. A fire started by drunken Westerners in a Muslim quarter of the city burned for days and destroyed a huge area. In January, a court official with the memorable nickname Mortsuflos, meaning bushy eyebrows, led a coup, strangled the young emperor, and refused to pay anything at all. The Crusade leadership and the Venetians then made a formal agreement in writing to take the city and divide it. 3/8 to the Venetians, 3/8 to the Crusaders, a quarter to whoever they elected as emperor. Clergy with the army obligingly explained that the Greeks were schismatics and worse than Jews, and that attacking them was a holy act. The assault came on the 12th of April in 1204 from the ships against the sea walls of the Golden Horn, with flying bridges rigged from the mastheads. The defence broke. Mortsuflos fled in the night, a host of golden daffodils, and for 3 the city that had never been taken in 900 years was given over to sack. What happened then was among the most destructive acts of cultural vandalism in European history, and the Western sources are as ashamed of it as the Greek ones. Churches were stripped, the tombs of the emperors were broken open, and the bodies stripped of their ornaments, including Justinian's, which was found undecayed. Hagia Sophia was ransacked, the great altar broken up for its silver, and a prostitute was set on the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs while the soldiers drank from the communion vessels. Bronze statues that had survived from classical antiquity, gathered in the city over 9 centuries, were melted for coin, among them a colossal Hercules attributed to the sculptor Lysippos, who had worked for Alexander the Great. The relics went west by the cartload and can still be seen in the treasuries and cathedrals of France and Italy. The 4 great bronze horses that had stood over the hippodrome were shipped to Venice and set above the doors of St. Mark's, where copies stand today. When the Pope, who had forbidden the whole thing, learned what had been done, he wrote in fury that the Crusaders had turned from spiritual things to worldly ones, and had stained their swords with Christian blood, and that the Greek Church now saw in the Latins only perdition and the works of darkness. The empire was carved up. A Flemish count became Latin Emperor of Constantinople. The Venetians took the ports and islands they wanted, choosing with a merchant's eye, and Dandolo styled himself lord of 1.25 of the Roman Empire. Frankish knights carved out duchies in Greece, and their castles still stand on Greek hilltops. But it did not hold. Greek successor states formed at once, at Nicaea in Asia Minor, at Trebizond on the Black Sea, and at Arta in western Greece, and each claimed to be the true empire in exile. The Latin emperors ruled a shrinking patch around the capital, so poor that one of them sold the lead from the palace roofs and pawned the crown of thorns to a Venetian bank, from which the King of France redeemed it and built a chapel for it in Paris. In 1261, a small Nicaean force, under a general named Alexios Stratibopoulos, happened to be near Constantinople and learned that the Latin garrison had sailed off on a raid. A local resident showed them an unguarded passage through the wall. They walked in at night with about 800 men, and by morning the Latin emperor was fleeing to a ship in his nightclothes, leaving his crown and sword behind. The empire was restored, but it was not the same thing that had been broken. 57 years of Latin rule had shattered the administrative machinery, scattered the aristocracy, ruined the commerce, and left the Greek world divided into pieces that no longer trusted one another. The wound of 1204 never healed. 800 years later, a pope would formally apologize for it. The man who took the crown in the recovered city was Michael VIII Palaiologos, and his family would hold the throne for the remaining 190 years, the longest dynasty in Roman history. ruling over a continuous shrinkage. Michael was an able and unscrupulous politician. He had made himself regent for a boy emperor of the Nicaean line, John Lascaris, and after the recapture of the city, he had the child blinded on his 11th birthday and shut away. The patriarch excommunicated him for it and refused to relent, and the memory of it poisoned his subjects' loyalty for the rest of his reign. His great achievement was survival against a threat from the west. Charles of Anjou, the brother of the King of France, had made himself King of Sicily and was openly preparing to reconquer Constantinople and restore the Latin Empire with papal blessing. Michael fought him with diplomacy and money, which was all he had. He sent gold to Charles's enemies in Italy. He negotiated with the King of Aragon, and in 1274, at a council at Lyon, he did the one thing he knew his people would never forgive. He submitted the Greek Church to Rome, accepting papal supremacy in order to remove the Pope's support for the invasion. The union was rejected furiously at home. Monks preached against it. Congregations refused communion from priests who accepted it. His own sister said she would rather see the empire ruined than the faith betrayed. He imprisoned and blinded opponents. And on Easter Monday in 1282 in Palermo, the population of Sicily rose against Charles's French garrison and massacred them in the rising called the Sicilian Vespers, and Charles's invasion fleet was destroyed in the harbour. Michael had helped to fund the conspiracy, and he said so in his memoirs with some pride. He died later that year, and his son repudiated the union of the churches immediately. What followed was a long, slow, remarkably cultured decline. The territory shrank from decade to decade. The Ottoman Turks, who at the start of the 14th century were only one of several small Turkish principalities in western Anatolia, took the last Byzantine cities there, one by one: Bursa, then Nicaea, then Nicomedia. The Serbian kingdom, under Stefan Dušan, expanded across the southern Balkans, and its ruler crowned himself emperor of the Serbs and Greeks. The Genoese established themselves at Galata, across the Golden Horn, fortified it, and came to collect 7 times as much customs revenue as the imperial government did on the other side of the water. The imperial navy ceased to exist, and through all this the Byzantines fought each other. Between 1321 and 1328, an emperor and his grandson fought a civil war. Between 1341 and 1347, there was a far worse one between a regency for a boy emperor and the ablest man in the empire, John Kantakouzenos, and both sides brought in foreign troops. It was Kantakouzenos who first hired Ottoman soldiers in numbers and married his daughter to the Ottoman ruler Orhan, and it was Ottoman troops brought over as allies in these wars who first settled permanently on the European side of the Straits. They took the fortress of Gallipoli in 1354 after an earthquake threw down its walls and refused to give it back, saying that God had given it to them. In 1347, in the middle of that civil war, the Black Death arrived. It came, as the plague of Justinian had, along the trade routes, and Constantinople was among the first European cities it struck. A contemporary account of it was written by the Emperor John VI, Kantakouzenos himself, who lost his own son to it, and described the symptoms with clinical precision, having read Thucydides on the plague of Athens and consciously imitating him. The city lost perhaps half its people. By the end of the 14th century, the empire was a handful of disconnected fragments. Constantinople itself, half empty, with fields and vineyards inside the walls where whole districts had once stood. Thessalonica, on and off, some islands, and the Peloponnese in southern Greece, ruled from Mistra as a semi-independent despotate, which was in fact prospering while everything else fell apart. From 1373, the emperor was formally a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan, required to pay tribute and to send troops to serve in Ottoman campaigns. The Emperor John V personally accompanied the Sultan's army as a subordinate on campaign in Asia Minor, helping to reduce cities that had been Roman. And in the middle of this humiliation, Byzantine intellectual life reached one of its highest points. This is the part of the story that people often find hardest to believe. The last century and a half of the empire produced a flowering of scholarship, of theology, of manuscript copying, of mathematics and astronomy, and the study of Plato, out of all proportion to the political ruin. Men who had almost no state left spent their lives arguing about the nature of divine light and correcting the text of Homer. Some of it was that the shrunken empire concentrated its talent in one place. Some of it was patronage from a court that had little else to spend on, and part of it was a deliberate turn towards Hellenism as the last Greeks in the world began to describe themselves not only as Romans but also, with new emphasis, as Hellenes, heirs to Plato and Sophocles. The most consequential result was that when these scholars began travelling, looking for patrons and for allies, they carried the Greek classics with them. Manuel Chrysaorus arrived in Florence in 1397 to teach Greek, and his students went on to teach half of Italy. Greek manuscripts moved into Italian libraries by the hundred. Cardinal Bessarion, a Byzantine churchman who ended up in the Roman Church, collected a library of Greek texts and left it to Venice, where it survives. A philosopher named George Gemistos Plethon came to Florence in 1439 as part of a delegation, and gave lectures on Plato to an audience that included Cosimo de' Medici, who was inspired to found an academy for Platonic studies. Plethon himself privately believed in a reformed paganism and wanted to restore the worship of the Olympian gods, which he was wise enough not to publish while he lived. It is not too much to say that the Italian Renaissance received a substantial transfusion of Greek learning directly from the dying empire, in the persons of men who had left because there was nothing left to stay for. Meanwhile, the empire got one unearned reprieve. In 1402, at Ankara, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, who had already blockaded Constantinople for years and was preparing the final assault, was crushed and captured by Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror out of Central Asia. The Ottoman state collapsed into a civil war among Bayezid's sons that lasted 11 years, and Constantinople was left alone. The Emperor Manuel II, who had been touring the courts of Europe begging for help, and had spent Christmas of 1400 as the guest of the King of England at Eltham Palace, came home to a city that had been saved by a man from Samarkand who had never heard of him. Manuel used the time well and kept the peace as long as he could. He advised his son not to provoke the Ottomans and to keep the appearance of union with the West dangling without ever concluding it, because the mere possibility of a Western crusade was worth more as a threat than the reality would ever be as a help. His son did not take the advice. In 1439, at the Council of Florence, the Emperor John VIII and most of his bishops signed a union with Rome, accepting papal primacy and the Western position on the procession of the Holy Spirit in exchange for a promise of military aid. The aid amounted to one crusade, which was destroyed by the Ottomans at Varna on the Black Sea coast in 1444. The union was rejected by the population of Constantinople as completely as Michael's had been. A high official of the empire is recorded as saying that he would rather see the Sultan's turban in the middle of the city than the Latin mitra. He was about to. In February of 1451, the Ottoman Sultan Murad died at Adrianople, and his 19-year-old son rode overnight to claim the throne. His name was Mehmed, and he had been sultan once before, as a boy of 12, and had been removed as insufficiently serious. He had not forgotten it. He was fluent in several languages, deeply read in history, obsessed with Alexander the Great, and possessed of a cold, calculating patience unusual in a man of that age. When the Byzantine ambassadors came to congratulate him, he swore on the Koran to respect the empire's territory, and they went home reassured. He had already decided. The following spring, he built a fortress. It stood on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point, directly opposite an older Ottoman castle on the Asian side, 5 miles north of Constantinople, and it took 4.5 months. When the emperor sent envoys to protest, Mehmed had them executed. The fortress was called the Throat Cutter, and it did exactly what the name suggests. Its cannon could sink any ship attempting to pass from the Black Sea, and the Black Sea was where Constantinople's grain now came from. He also acquired artillery, and this is the part of the story that mattered most. A Hungarian founder named Orban had come to the emperor first, offering to cast great guns, and the emperor could not pay him, so Orban went to Mehmed, who asked whether he could cast a cannon capable of throwing a stone against the walls of Constantinople, and gave him 4 times the salary he asked for. The greatest of the guns Orban made had a barrel over 8 meters long, fired a stone ball weighing more than half a ton, and required 60 oxen and 400 men to move it. It could be fired perhaps 7 times a day, and its crews had to stuff their ears and open their mouths against the concussion. Against that, the Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos had about 7,000 defenders for 6.5 kilometers of wall, of whom around 2,000 were foreigners. He had appealed everywhere. Venice sent a little. Genoa officially sent nothing, but a professional soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo came anyway with 700 well-armed men at his own expense, and the emperor made him commander of the land walls. The Ottoman army numbered perhaps 80,000. Constantine himself is a figure it is difficult not to like. He was 57, had been despot in the Peloponnese, was known as a competent and personally brave soldier, and had no illusions. When Mehmed offered him his life and the rule of a province in the Peloponnese if he surrendered the city, he replied that to give up the city was beyond his authority, or anyone else's, since all of the people together had resolved to die and not count their lives dear. The siege began on the 6th of April in 1453. The great guns started their work and did not stop. The bombardment went on for 6 weeks, and it broke the outer wall in places despite everything the defenders could do. And what they did was extraordinary. Every night, men and women and children came out and rebuilt what had been knocked down that day, filling the gaps with rubble, timber, earth, and bales of wool, which absorbed the impact better than stone. The Turks would knock down a section, and in the morning there would be a new stockade behind it. The city's other defence was the chain across the Golden Horn, which meant that the whole northern flank of the wall could not be attacked from the water. In late April, 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese and 1 imperial transport, fought their way through the entire Ottoman fleet in full view of both armies, in a battle that lasted hours in a failing wind and got into the harbour. Mehmed rode his horse into the sea in fury, watching, and afterwards had his admiral beaten. So Mehmed went around the chain, over a single night, using greased wooden rollers and teams of oxen. His men dragged some 70 ships overland from the Bosphorus, up a hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and down into the Golden Horn. In the morning the defenders looked out and saw an Ottoman fleet inside the harbour. It did not win the siege by itself, but it forced them to stretch their tiny garrison to man the harbour wall too. Underground, German and Serbian miners dug towards the foundations. And a Scottish engineer in the Emperor's service named John Grant countermined and met them, and there were fights in the dark under the earth with the roofs falling in. Through all of it, the two sides talked. There were embassies back and forth, offers of tribute, offers of surrender. There were also portents, and the people of the city read them with dread. A statue of the Virgin fell from its platform during a procession into the mud. A thunderstorm turned the streets into rivers and stopped the procession entirely. A thick, unseasonable fog settled on the city, and when it lifted at nightfall, a strange light was seen playing around the dome of Hagia Sophia. The Turks saw it too in the camp, and Mehmed's advisors told him it was the light of the true faith about to enter the church. On the 28th of May, the bombardment stopped, the bombardment quiet, and the Ottoman camp went quiet, and the Sultan's heralds announced that the assault would come the next day, and that the customary 3 days of plunder would follow. In the city, the fighting men left their posts to fill Hagia Sophia for a last service, and Orthodox and Catholic clergy served it together, and the differences that had divided them for 4 centuries were set aside for the evening because there was no more time. The Emperor received communion, asked forgiveness of everyone present, and went back to the wall. The attack began about 1:30 in the morning in 3 waves, timed so that each would exhaust the defenders before the next came in. The first was the irregulars, thousands of them, poorly armed, driven forward and destroyed. The second was Anatolian infantry, better trained, and they got over the outer wall in one place before being thrown back. The third was the Janissaries, the Sultan's own regiments, the finest infantry in the world at that time, and they came forward in step, in silence, in good order. 2 things happened in a few minutes near the same spot. A small postern gate called the Kerkerporta, used for sorties, had been left unlocked or unbarred after a raid, and a few dozen Turks got through it and up onto the wall and raised a flag. And Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, who had held the critical sector for 7 weeks and had been the backbone of the defence, was hit by a shot that went through his breastplate. Bleeding badly, he asked to be carried to a ship. The Emperor begged him to stay. He went, and his men, seeing the gate open behind them and their commander leaving, broke. The Janissaries poured into the gap between the walls. A giant of a man named Hassan of Ulubud was said to have been first onto the inner wall, and to have been killed there, but by then there were too many behind him. Constantine was seen last, near the gate of St. Romanos. The accounts agree that he threw off the imperial mantle and the purple boots so that he would not be recognised. Said aloud that the city was taken and he was still alive, and rode into the press of soldiers with a few companions and disappeared. His body was never certainly identified. The Turks found a corpse in imperial buskins, and Mehmed had the head displayed, but nobody could be sure, and legends began almost immediately. In one of them, an angel turned the last emperor to marble and hid him in a cave beneath the Golden Gate to wake when the city is Greek again. The sack lasted, by most accounts, 1 day, rather than the promised 3, because Mehmed wanted a functioning capital, not a ruin. It was still terrible. Thousands died in the streets. Tens of thousands were enslaved. The people who had crowded into Hagia Sophia in the last hours, believing an old prophecy that an angel would descend at the column and save the city, were taken there. Mehmed rode into the city in the afternoon. He went first to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and poured a handful of earth over his own head as an act of humility before God. Inside, he found a soldier hacking at the marble floor. for the pieces and struck him with the flat of his sword, saying that the buildings were his and the plunder was theirs. He ordered the church converted to a mosque, and the first Friday prayers were held there a few days later. Then he went to the ruined Great Palace, which had been derelict for 2 centuries, and walked through the empty halls, and is said to have quoted a Persian couplet about the spider weaving its web in the palace of the emperors and the owl calling the watch in the towers of Afrasiab. He was 21. He took the title Caesar Rum, Caesar of Rome, and he meant it. He rebuilt and repopulated the city, brought in Greeks, Armenians, Jews and Turks to fill it, and appointed a new Orthodox patriarch himself, in a ceremony deliberately modelled on the Byzantine one, giving him authority over all the Christians of the empire. The city has been called Istanbul ever since, from a Greek phrase meaning simply to the city, which is what people had said for 1,000 years when they meant Constantinople. The last fragments held out a little longer. Mistra in the Peloponnese fell in 1460, Trebizond on the Black Sea, the last Greek state calling itself Roman, surrendered in 1461, and that was the end of the Roman Empire, 2,206 years after the traditional founding of the city on the Tiber. What was left behind is easier to find than most people expect, once you know where to look. Start with the word itself. Nobody in that empire ever called it Byzantine. The name was invented in 1557, more than a century after the fall, by a German scholar named Hieronymus Wolff, who was editing Greek historians, and wanted a convenient label to distinguish the medieval Greek state from the classical Roman one. It caught on among Western scholars, partly because it was useful, and partly because it suited them. Calling those people Byzantines rather than Romans allowed the West to claim the Roman inheritance for itself through the popes and through the German emperors who styled themselves Holy Roman. The people it described would have found the whole idea insulting. Along with the name came a reputation, and it was a bad one. For 3 centuries after Wolff, Western writers used Byzantium as a byword for everything that was decadent, superstitious, effeminate, and corrupt. An 18th century historian called its story a tedious and uniform tale of weakness and misery. Another said its history was a worthless repertory of declamations and miracles. The word Byzantine entered English as an adjective meaning needlessly complicated and full of intrigue. Almost none of that survives serious examination now, and the scholarship of the last century has quietly dismantled it. Consider the plain facts. This was a state that lasted, in continuous institutional descent, for 1100 years after Constantine dedicated his city, and that is longer than any other Christian polity, and longer than nearly any state in history. It did so while occupying the most exposed position on the map, at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, with enemies on every side for its entire existence. It lost its richest provinces in the 7th century and reinvented itself. It lost its capital in the 13th and took it back. Weakness does not do that. What it did was manage decline with extraordinary skill for centuries at a time, using diplomacy, bribery, marriage, missionary work and intelligence work. Where it could not use force, which is exactly what a state in that position ought to do, and which looks cowardly only to people who have never had to try it. Then there is what it preserved. Almost everything we have of ancient Greek literature came to us through Byzantine hands. Homer, the tragedians, Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Thucydides, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, Galen. These texts survived because generation after generation of Constantinopolitan scholars copied them, corrected them, wrote commentaries on them, and taught them in schools at a time when the works were simply unavailable in Western Europe. A 9th century patriarch named Photios compiled a book of summaries and extracts of nearly 300 works he had read, and for about half of them his summary is now the only trace we have that they ever existed. When Greek learning returned to Italy in the 15th century and lit the Renaissance, it came in the luggage of Byzantine exiles. Then the law. Justinian's compilation, rediscovered in 11th century Bologna, became the foundation of the legal tradition of continental Europe, and, through it, of much of Latin America and Asia. The concepts and much of the vocabulary of civil law in a great many countries today can be traced back to a commission of lawyers working in Constantinople in the 530s under an emperor who could not sleep, then the faith. The Orthodox churches of Greece, Russia, Ukraine, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, and elsewhere are the direct religious descendants of Byzantine Christianity, and together they count several 100 million people. The liturgy sung in those churches is substantially the liturgy of Constantinople. The style of the icons is a Byzantine style, deliberately conserved. The Cyrillic alphabet came from a Byzantine mission. When Moscow began, in the 16th century, to describe itself as the Third Rome, the first having fallen to barbarians and the second to Turks, it was making a claim about inheritance that its rulers took entirely seriously, and the double-headed eagle they adopted was the badge of the Palaiologos emperors. Then the buildings. Hagia Sophia still stands, and it changed architecture permanently. Every great domed mosque of the Ottoman classical age, the works of the architect Sinan and his successors, is in conversation with it, and their silhouettes on the skyline of Istanbul are the reason the city looks the way it does. Byzantine church design shaped the architecture of Russia. The Balkans and Armenia. St. Mark's in Venice is a Byzantine building in an Italian city, and the horses over its door were stolen from the hippodrome. And then there are the things that are harder to point at. The idea of a Christian empire whose ruler is a sacred figure. The practice of professional, salaried, examined bureaucracy at a time when Western kingdoms were governed by whichever nobleman was standing closest. Hospitals with wards and specialists and charitable funding. Diplomacy as a permanent craft with archives and protocols, and a school of thought behind it, which the Venetians learned directly and passed on to the rest of Europe. There is one more legacy, and it is a strange one to end on. For 4 centuries after 1453, Greek villagers told a story about the priest who was in the middle of the liturgy in Hagia Sophia when the Turks broke in. The wall opened, and he stepped into it with the chalice in his hands, and the wall closed behind him, and he is still there. When the city is Greek again, the story goes, the wall will open, and he will come out and finish the sentence he was saying. It is a folk tale, and no wall opened, and the city did not become Greek again, but it tells you something true about what the place had meant. For 1,000 years, an enormous number of people believed that Constantinople was the centre of the world, that as long as its walls held, there was order in creation, and that an emperor sat there who was the successor of Augustus and the deputy of God. That belief was mistaken in the way that all such beliefs are mistaken. It also built one of the longest lasting political structures the human species has ever managed. And it kept a great deal of what we value alive through centuries when it could easily have been lost. The empire that outlived Rome by 1,000 years did not go out in glory. It went out with 7,000 men on a wall they could not hold, and an emperor who took off his purple so that he could die as an ordinary soldier among his own. That, in the end, is the story of Rome's eastern survivor, and here our long journey settles into stillness. The chariots have stopped in the hippodrome, The chants have faded from the great church, and the lamps along the sea walls have gone out one by one. The names grow quiet. Justinian and Theodora, Heraclius, Basil, Anna and her books, Constantine on the last morning. They rest now, all of them, under the same warm dark. There is nothing left to hold and nothing left to do. The walls have kept their watch for a very long time, and they are content to keep it without you. So let your thoughts drift out over the water, past the harbour chain and the fishing boats, out to where the two seas meet under a sky, going soft with morning. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink a little further into the warmth beneath you. The story will still be here tomorrow. It has waited 1,000 years already. It can wait one more night. Rest now. Let it go. Sleep well, and good night.